Okay, now we talked about everything that you need to do vermicomposting and to make a successful vermicomposting bin. So now we're going to set one up. This is going to be our bin, and like I said, you know, it has a nice solid lid, but it's very loose fitting. So a nice rule of thumb when you're buying a plastic bin to use as a plastic for something like vermicomposting, make sure you're getting the cheap ones. The more you pay for them, a lot of times they'll say airtight, you know, it seals nicely. For a vermicomposting bin, you don't want it to seal airtight, and you don't want to spend a lot of money on it. So here's our new bin, and the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and prepare the bin by drilling holes in it. So here we have the drill bit, and this I said between a 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch size holes, so we got a 3/8 inch bit here. And so we're going to make our holes, drainage holes. Now I've drilled them all in the center, but when the bin is sitting up like this is actually the lowest surface in the bin, so we'll make sure I put some in there as well. Otherwise there will be a layer of water that never drains. So now we got our drainage holes in the bottom, and as Chris mentioned, when you want some aeration holes as well. And so we figure if we let our worms work and wait a while before we harvest the compost, the vermicompost or the worm castings, we might let it fill up about this high. So we're going to put our aeration holes up near the top of the bin. Got our compost bin with the drainage holes in the bottom, which also will help with aeration. We got some aeration holes drilled around the top. Our lid, it's still a solid lid, fits kind of loosely. So now we're ready to move on to the next part of putting our vermicomposting bin together. And what would that be, Anna?
Well, it's time to start filling it up with bedding material and some food scraps before we add our worms. Now here we've got some shredded newspaper that's already been soaked in some water, and we do want to take an opportunity right now to show you the squeeze test. This is fairly wet, so when I squeeze it, quite a bit of moisture comes out. Now if this was just the only bedding we were adding today, this would be considered too wet, so we'd want to squeeze it out and remove some of that moisture. But today, since we're starting a brand new bin, we're actually mixing in some very dry material as well. We've got a bag of chopped up leaves here, and we've got some of these cardboard egg cartons we're going to add. So all that extra moisture will actually be absorbed by our dry materials. So we do want to start layering this in our bin, and I'm going to start with some dry. I'll do about a 1/2 inch deep of these chopped up leaves. This stuff is really great. Worms love it. So start saving the leaves.
And as you can see, Chris had talked about making sure that you chop up your leaves, which is very good. Just want to point out one thing, I don't know if we have yet, but a lawnmower is a great way to chop these leaves up. So if you got a bagging lawnmower, it's great. But I do want to point out that if you have a lawnmower that you're using for this, make sure it's not leaking gas or not leaking oil, because just a minor leak that gets into your chopped up leaves, or if you're using the grass clippings as part of the bedding, just a little bit of oil or gasoline especially, if that gets into that material, it can kill your worms. So make sure that your lawnmower is in good condition and not leaking oil or gas.
So you can see I've layered some of this wet newspaper over our dry leaves, and I'm just going to keep layering and throw some of these egg cartons in. Now I like these egg cartons because they have a lot of surface area. That's important when the worms start reproducing. It gives them plenty of places to hide, and it provides some air pockets in here as well. So these are really great to add to our vermicompost bins. And you just kind of tear them up into some smaller pieces very quickly. This is a great activity to do with your children. They love doing this, but you want to make sure you've got some smaller pieces than just the whole egg carton, because something like this would take forever for them to break down. We're going to do another layer of this wet shredded newspaper over top of our egg cartons that we've just added. You can see this is quite wet, so it'll actually start percolating downward and get some of that dry material moist enough.
So this is just like what Dr. Joe was pointing out before when we were talking about getting the material ready for a regular compost pile, is if you got brown material like this, pre-wetting it really helps to moisten it. Yeah. If you've ever had a super dry sponge, you'll know they're sometimes difficult to get wet. So
I'm going to add some more dry bedding over top. And Joe has a neat trick for shredding your newspapers pretty quickly.
If you have, this would be some more dry material. If you want to shred your newspaper, you read it like this, and then at the fold, well, if you try to tear a newspaper this way, it doesn't tear very easily. But turn it and tear it from the fold down, it makes nice long strips. Kind of you had a frustrating day and you want to get out some of that frustration, just grab a stack of newspaper and have at it. And then you got some nice shredded newspaper to add to the vermicomposting pot.
Boy, this looks delicious.
Well, we're going to make it even more delicious because next we're going to add some food for our worms. And in here we've got Joe and Paula's kitchen scraps and my kitchen scraps. So it's a real mix of materials. You can see some onion skins, avocado peels, some garlic paper. What I have in mind that we're not going to add is the citrus rind. Normally this would go into my normal compost bins at home. They do break down eventually because I have such a large system. And I also have eggshells in mind. So this is going to be a really good material to add because remember that functions as grit so that the worms can digest and grind up their food, and it's a lot more efficient for them.
And the onion skins and the garlic skins, that's one of those materials that you don't want to use a lot of them.
Right.
Because the worms, it will take them a little while to break those down and eat them. So that's one of the things that you use a little bit in moderation. And they can handle it.
Yep. And the citrus rinds especially you don't want to add because it actually repels the worms. They really don't like the citric acid, the oils in those. So make sure you don't add those into your bin. And some of this stuff is fairly large pieces. Remember, we mentioned in the lecture that worms digest and break down smaller pieces a lot more efficiently. So we are going to chop some of this up before we add it to our bin. It's kind of like a reverse cooking show. These are all food scraps and what we would consider to be trash, but we're actually cooking for worms today. And just roughly chopping some of this up into smaller bits. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just giving them a lot of entry points where they can get in and feed. We're going to sprinkle that in a layer on top of our bedding. Some eggshells.
And coffee grounds and tea bags, those are also very good to go into your vermicomposting bin. Worms love those. Just think about it though, if you have a tea bag, go ahead and remove that staple if it's one that has the staple in it before you throw it in with your vermicompost.
It'd be best to break it up entirely, really, if you could, huh?
Yeah, if you can rip the bag up, that's nice, because then they can get to everything easily.
I think I have some coffee grounds in here, so I'm going to add those as well. They really like coffee grounds. If you can get with any kind of coffee shop, sometimes they'll save them for you if you have a lot of worms.
And the coffee grounds, actually, they can sometimes function similar to the sand or grit in the worm's craw. The coffee grounds, as they're eating them and digesting them, they can put them into their gizzard and use that to grind up the other material.
So you can see, we got some more citrus in here. We're going to remove that and sort it. Here's, looks like Joe and Paula's coffee grounds. I'll put those in there. Avocado peels are something that take a long time to break down, but they will eventually eat them. So sometimes when you're sifting your compost, you'll find your avocado peels that look kind of untouched, but they will eventually get to them as they soften.
One thing that you don't want to put into your vermicomposting bin, similar to the cold composting, which Chris talked about, is try to keep the seeds out, because they will germinate. The seeds aren't going to be killed, the temperature doesn't get really high, and the worms aren't going to eat the seeds. And so if you put seeds in, you're probably going to get germination happening in your vermicompost bin. So keep the seeds out.
Some people really like that, and they call them garden zombies or kitchen zombies, and they actually plant the plants out into their gardens.
And diseased organisms, diseased plant organisms, that's another one that you probably want to keep out of your vermicomposting bin. Now, there have been studies that have shown that some of the material, once it passes through the worm's digestive system, that kills a lot of pathogenic organisms. But because the studies aren't consistently showing all that to happen, and there's some more work needs to be done, we tend to say keep the diseased plant material and any such as that out of your vermicomposting.
Another thing I was thinking about that similar to coffee grounds that would help in the composting pile here, the vermicomposting bin, is nutshells. Pecans, almonds, walnuts, things like that. As long as they're raw, you don't want the salted ones or anything like that. But if they're plain nutshells, you can grind them up and add them to the bin, and it will really help also with that digestion what the worms have. But they need to be small so that they can actually swallow them.
So we've got plenty of food scraps and eggshells, coffee grounds, and good things that worms love in here. We're going to add a little more bedding material over top, so we bury those food scraps. This helps with keeping the fruit flies and other things, other insect pests out of here. It gives the worms some cover so that they can eat that stuff.
Yeah, this is important in a regular composting pile too. You never want to have your raw food scraps just on top of the pile. You always want to bury them. Sometimes actually I will have a bag of leaves next to my compost pile so that if I add some scraps, I can go ahead and just reach in the bag and cover them up. You never want to leave that material on top. It's definitely an invitation to the flies and other pests.
Yep.
And smells too. This layer on top will help keep the smell down as well.
Yeah, the carbon will actually absorb the smells, so it's a good idea to do this.
In vermicomposting, we talked about the cold composting, hot composting, how long each one of those take. Vermicomposting, you're looking at probably 2 to 3 months once you start your vermicompost bin before you actually start getting the finished product that you can harvest and use. So think of it along that way, 2 to 3 months depending on the environment that the bin is in.
Mm-hmm. And that'll change as the material changes, and also as the pile matures, and you get more worms in there, it's going to change a little bit.
They go faster the more worms you have. And today, remember in that lecture we said you start with 6 worms, you end up with 1,500 in 6 months. Well, we got about 6 worms in here. So we'll show you what the red wigglers look like. They're pretty small. There's one right here. And we're going to add him and his buddies. These are from my pile at home. We're going to add them into what to them is going to feel like a mansion after being in this Tupperware. And just sprinkle them right on top.
Oh boy, you can really see why they're called wigglers.
They jump around, yeah.
Some of these guys, as soon as they hit the ground, they bounced and flipped like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So live long and prosper.
Yeah. Now you can order a pound or 2 if you want from a commercial provider. They're not that expensive, or like this, as Anna has done right here, just get some from a already established vermicompost bin and move them to a new one, and they love it.
Yep. It's always fun to get a bag of worms in the mail too. You can order them online very easily and they come quickly.
So are you ready to put the top on?
I think
Now we're ready to put the top on.
Now, let's just go over a little bit of maintenance. What are we going to, how often do you need to check this? Where are you going to put this? Things like that.
We definitely want to have it out of direct sunlight, so it's going to be in a shady area. Now, in the New Orleans area, the greater New Orleans area, we can usually leave a vermicompost bin out year-round. Even in the summertime, if you got it in a shady area where there's lots of air movement, you don't want it in a pocketed area where there's no air movement. In the summertime, if it's shady, you can keep it outside. In the wintertime, it never gets too cold, so we almost never have to worry about insulating it. But if it's going to drop and get really cold at night, you can always just wrap it with a quilt or something for the night. So for us, it's pretty easy. Nice shady location, but if you're somewhere else in the state of Louisiana, or even somewhere else in the U.S. or somewhere else, think about that. As Chris mentioned, if it gets above 90 degrees, you're probably going to kill your worms very rapidly. 90, 95 degrees, you're going to kill them very rapidly. If it drops below 40 degrees for an extended period of time, you're going to freeze them. So 60 to 85 degrees, 60 to 80 degrees, somewhere around in there are the ideal temperatures, but they can take extremes a little bit less than that and a little bit higher than that, but you don't want to get too extreme. So locating it in a place where it's going to stay like that is important. And we mentioned holes in the bottom. Chris mentioned that. So it's going to be draining. So if you're going to put it inside, as you can see right now even,
it's draining.
There's drainage happening. And that's, as we talked about, from the bedding being super moist. So have a collection receptacle on it, like a solid tray or something to catch that as it drains. If you're going to have it inside, especially because you don't want it ruining your floors or anything. And if it's outside, you could actually have it elevated something like this up on bricks or something, and then it can drain. Or you can put a collection underneath it outside as well and collect the material to use as compost tea. So locating it, that's an important thing.
Yeah, I really like some of the kits, the worm farm systems you can buy online, because they actually have some that collect that worm tea. That's what it's called, is worm tea. And it has a little spigot, and you can actually fill up a watering can with it and mix it with water and use it right on your plants. Safe to apply directly to your garden as is. And it's really good, rich source of nutrients for your plants. In terms of like a weekly maintenance, I like to open it up once a week and check how the moisture level is and water it if needed, just with a little hand watering can. And I keep this compost bin on my kitchen counter, so as soon as it fills up, that's when I would chop that material and put it into the bin. Kind of on a weekly basis. You don't want to put too much material in, so you can always freeze the scraps or add them to your regular compost pile until your worm populations get large enough to handle the volume that your kitchen will produce.
Now if you freeze them, you want to defrost them before you add them to your...
You don't want to give your worms popsicles. They don't appreciate that. It does lower the temperature in the bin, so make sure you thaw out any kitchen scraps before you add them to your vermicompost.
And one other thing I wanted to add, we were talking about the drainage. If you do add a drainage, a catch basin under the bottom, and you put it outside, just check it for standing water, because you could really have a mosquito problem. So make sure that you don't encourage that kind of situation.
That's true. And as Anna said, she checks it, maybe once or twice a week to add new material as it becomes available. And another thing is that you're checking when you take it off is when you take the lid off, the first thing you want to do is, what's it smell like? Because that odor can tell you a lot. If there's smells like ammonia, that means you've got an anaerobic conditions in there. Your worms are probably dying, and there's not enough aeration, and that's a real problem if it smells like ammonia. If you know what you put in there is the kind of stuff we put in there, food scraps and everything like that, and you open it up and it kind of has this real foul smell like rotting meat, you might want to check the moisture and everything, make sure your worms aren't dying. But just that nice odor when you open it up to check it or to add the food, make note of that in your head. Okay, I'm checking my worms also by how they smell, how my vermicompost bin smells.
Yeah, and usually if I smell that ammonia, I'll add some brown material like cardboard or newspaper or chopped up leaves, because that helps absorb the odor, but also it gets it back in balance. You need to add that set of carbon to the system to kind of mitigate the issues.
Can you show me what you would do to add new material? How would you do you just add it to the top, or
Yep.
do you rake it to the side? What would you do?
So when we're adding material and feeding our worms, normally I just sprinkle it over the top and cover it with some more brown material as I'm adding my food scrap. When we're getting to the point where the bin is starting to get full, it's time to start thinking about harvesting our worm castings. Usually those top few layers are the most recent material that we've added, so they're not completely broken down or composted. I actually kind of gently take my fingers and rake that material off to one side. I'll keep adding food scraps and carbon and moisture to that side of the bin, but the other side of the bin I will not water. And gradually the worms will migrate to where the food and the moisture are, so that I can harvest those finished worm castings from the other side of the bin.
Yeah, and then once she harvests it, she levels it out again and lets them go again for another couple of months. And keep layering on top.
Yep.
So now we've got our new vermicompost bin set up and ready to go, and we'll keep adding fresh material as it becomes available. And as you saw, we started out with a low population of worms, so we're probably looking at maybe 5 or 6 months before we start getting some really good finished compost in this bin. But that's, as Anna mentioned, black gold. It's well worth the wait, and your plants in your garden are going to love it.
If you have a vermicomposting bin or a worm farm set up at your house, we'd love to see it. Remember to post it to the Facebook discussion group and share it with everyone else in the class.